The geologists called it the Varith Basin. The aliens who built their colony there called it Sorvin, which in their tongue meant, the place where sky meets forever. They had no word for irony. They would learn one soon. Commander Zelvara Mox stood at the rim of the observation platform, her 4 amber eyes scanning the horizon where 3 suns were setting in staggered intervals. She was tall by the standards of her species, the Varenthi, standing nearly 2.5 meters with a slender frame of bioluminescent cartilage visible beneath translucent skin. Her species had crossed 11 star systems. They had mapped the gas giants of Tyrellus IV and seeded life on barren moons. They had done everything except study the small, unremarkable blue planet they now called home. "Report from Survey Team Omicron 7, said her aide, a young male named Drivos Tan, pressing a data slate into her 3-fingered hand. "The southern basin shows unusual geological vibration signatures. The instruments classify them as tectonic precursors, but the depth is anomalous." Zelvara took the slate and glanced at it without urgency. Tectonic precursors were common. Their colony of 14,000 settlers had been established in the basin for 62 years, and the geologists had flagged seismic anomalies 17 times before. Each time, the planet had merely stretched and groaned like a sleeping animal, then gone quiet again. "Recommend standard monitoring escalation," she said, handing the slate back. Drivos hesitated. "Chief Geologist Pruin Vasil requests a meeting. He says this reading is different." "Different how?" "He says the vibrations are not coming from below the crust. They are coming from within the crust. And they are not random. They form a pattern." Zelvara turned slowly and looked at her aide. The sky above the basin was the color of burnt copper, streaked by the passage of methane clouds and the occasional flash of distant lightning. The world was beautiful and brutal and deeply, profoundly old. But she had always thought of it as geologically boring, a planet past its dramatic youth, settling into the slow drift of middle age. "Schedule the meeting for tomorrow," she said. "Priority level 2. It was the last decision she would make without fear. 3 kilometers below the observation platform, the Earth was preparing to speak. It had been building the sentence for 65,000 years, loading pressure into the Deccan Traps, that vast system of volcanic formations spreading across what would one day be called India. The mantle had been stirring for millennia, fed by a plume of superheated rock rising from the planet's core like a fist unclenching in slow motion. The Varenthi instruments had detected the edge of it. They had not understood what the edge meant. Pruin Vasil understood. The chief geologist had spent 40 years studying planetary volcanism, had watched 3 worlds die, had written his doctoral thesis on the phenomenon the Varenthi called the melt bloom, what humans would eventually call a large igneous province event. He had recognized the signature 3 weeks ago and had spent those weeks trying to convince himself he was wrong. He was not wrong. In his laboratory that night, surrounded by holographic models of the subsurface geology, Pruin Vasil ran the simulation for the 200th time and watched the same result. The Deccan Traps were entering an eruptive phase. Not a minor one. Not the kind that filled the sky with sulfur dioxide for a season and killed crops for a decade. The kind that reshaped continents. The kind that changed everything that breathed. He composed his report carefully, trimming the catastrophic language, framing it as a hypothesis rather than a certainty. He was, above all, a scientist. He would not cause panic with incomplete data. But as he saved the file and prepared for sleep, he looked once more at the simulation. The Varenthi colony sat at the center of the impact zone. The western edge of the basin was bounded by a ridge of fractured basalt sitting directly above a pressure chamber the size of a small sea. When it blew, and his model said it would blow within 18 months, the eruptive flow would not spread evenly across the landscape. The topography of the basin would funnel it. The lava would move like a river, fast and dense and unstoppable, filling every low point, every road, every structure from the ground up. He called it, in his notes, the concrete river. Because that was what it would look like. A river of liquid rock moving at speed, covering everything, burying everything, preserving everything beneath a tombstone of basalt that would harden over millions of years into something indistinguishable from the crust itself. Pruin Vasil closed his eyes and thought about 14,000 people sleeping in a bowl of ancient stone. He thought about tomorrow's meeting, now rescheduled to priority level 2. He thought about how long it took bureaucracies to act. Then he opened a new file and began writing the evacuation proposal. He would not wait for the meeting. Outside, the earth breathed slowly, patiently, in the deep language of stone, counting down. The colonial administrative center of Sorvin had been built to last. This was not hubris. It was engineering. The Varenthi had constructed the building from compressed polymer alloys reinforced with silicate lattice, capable of withstanding Category 9 seismic events, solar flare bombardment, and sustained acidic atmospheric conditions. The architects had been proud of this. They had not considered the possibility that the ground beneath the building might become the building's enemy. Administrator Halvine Krax sat at the head of the briefing table and listened to Pruin Vasil with the patience of someone who believed they already knew the conclusion. Krax was a bureaucrat of the highest order, not a corrupt one or an evil one, but one so deeply embedded in procedure and hierarchy that information was processed through institutional filters before it reached his understanding. He was 61 years old, had administered 3 colonies, and had never once evacuated one. You are suggesting a full evacuation of 14,000 settlers based on a seismic model, Krax said. Based on a convergence of 7 independent geological indicators, Pruin said. The mantle plume activity, the fault stress accumulation in the Vareth Ridge, the sulfur dioxide uptick in the eastern vents, the groundwater temperature anomalies, and the surface inflation data from our orbital sensors. Each indicator alone is ambiguous. Together they form a picture I cannot interpret as anything other than a Category Omega volcanic event. Category Omega, repeated Krax slowly. That classification requires confirmation from the Planetary Science Directorate. Have you submitted your data to the Directorate? I submitted it yesterday. I have not received confirmation of receipt. Then we wait for confirmation. Krax folded his hands. Pruin, I respect your expertise. But the settlement infrastructure alone represents 340 years of accumulated resource investment. The evacuation of 14,000 citizens requires orbital transport capacity that does not currently exist in this system. We would need to requisition 6 freight transports from the Torellis relay, a process that takes 14 months. You are telling me we need to begin that process today, before Directorate confirmation, based on a model? Yes, Pruin said simply. That is exactly what I am telling you. Zelvara Mox was also in the room. She had upgraded the meeting to priority level 1 after reading Pruin's evacuation proposal the previous night. She had not slept. She had read the proposal 3 times and then spent 4 hours reviewing the geological data herself. She was not a geologist, but she was a commander, and commanders learn to recognize the difference between a scientist hedging and a scientist afraid. Pruin Vasil was afraid. How long do we have? She asked. My models suggest initial eruptive activity within 6 to 18 months. The main flow event, the concrete river scenario, I estimate between 14 and 24 months from today. But I want to be honest, the uncertainty range is significant. It could be sooner. Could it be later? Krax asked with the hopefulness of a man reaching for any branch. It could be. But I would not plan for that possibility. The meeting continued for 3 hours. Krax requested secondary confirmation from the colony's second geologist, a junior researcher named Sith Paloran who had been on site for only 4 years. Paloran reviewed Pruin's data overnight and returned the following morning with a paler face and a shaking voice, confirming the analysis but adding several caveats about model uncertainty that Krax latched onto like a lifeline. A subcommittee was formed. 3 working groups were established. Data packages were prepared for transmission to the Planetary Science Directorate. A preliminary inquiry was sent to the Torellis relay about transport availability. Zelvara watched all of this happen and said nothing in the meetings, but at night she walked to the edge of the colony's perimeter and looked out at the dark basin and listened. She had commanded 3 military operations in her career. She had learned one lesson above all others: the enemy does not wait for your paperwork. She made a private decision. She began quietly, without administrative authorization, to inventory the colony's emergency vehicles and calculate their range. She contacted the colony's medical chief, Dr. Orvana Quellis, and asked casually, as if it were an exercise, how quickly a mass medical evacuation could be organized. She walked the outer roads of the settlement and identified the high-ground routes, the ones that would remain passable if the low areas flooded. She was building an evacuation plan that no one had asked her to build. Meanwhile, 3 kilometers below, the Earth's patience was thinning. The mantle plume had been building for so long that the crust above it had begun to bow upward, a process visible in the orbital inflation data as a subtle dome rising across the basin's center. The Vareth Ridge, that long spine of fractured basalt to the west, was experiencing microfractures at a rate 14 times its decade average. The pressure chamber beneath was filling. It was not a matter of whether. It was a matter of when. Drivos Tan found Zelvara at the perimeter one evening and stood beside her in silence for a long moment. He was young, 28, recently arrived from the Varenthi home system, assigned to Sorvendal as his first colonial posting. He had never seen a world die before. "Commander," he said quietly, "I have been looking at the eastern route. The plateau road runs above the 400-meter elevation line. If the basin fills, the plateau road stays clear. It connects to the highland staging area." Zelvara looked at him. "Have I told you to look at that?" "No, Commander. Are you good at carrying out orders you haven't been given?" "I try to be, Commander." She almost smiled. "Good. Keep looking." Above them, the 3 suns had set hours ago, and the night sky was thick with stars, indifferent and ancient. Below them, the earth was done waiting for paperwork. The first sign was not the eruption. It was the smell. Sith Pelorin noticed it during a routine monitoring walk along the eastern vent field at dawn. The vents had always emitted traces of sulfur dioxide, weak enough to be harmless at surface concentration, a permanent faint egg-rot background note in the air that colonists had long since stopped noticing. But this morning it was stronger. Not dangerously strong. Just unmistakably stronger. She pulled out her handheld sensor and ran a spot analysis. The SO2 concentration was 340 parts per million. 2 weeks ago it had been 80. The week before that it had been 85. The week before that 82. The trend had seemed like noise. Now, standing in the faint morning light with the sharp chemical bite of sulfur in her throat, it did not seem like noise at all. She called Pruin Vasil immediately. "How fast?" was all he asked. "4-fold increase in 14 days. There was silence on the line. Then, "I am recalculating the timeline. Stay at the vent field. I will call you back." To stayed. She sat on a boulder near vent 7 and watched the thin plumes of gas rise and disperse in the dawn breeze. The vents were roughly a meter across, old ones so old they had been here before the colony arrived, ancient channels from deep geological time. They had always seemed permanent to her, as permanent as stone, as permanent as the ridge line to the west. She looked at the ridge. In the growing light she could see something she had not noticed before. A thin, dark line, almost a shadow, running along the base of the ridge where it met the basin floor. She walked toward it. As she got closer she realized it was a crack. Fresh. The edges were sharp and unweathered, white rock exposed to air for the first time. It ran for perhaps 300 meters along the ridge base, inconsistent in width, narrowing to a hairline in some sections and opening to nearly 4 centimeters in others. She photographed it with her sensor unit. She photographed it again from different angles. Then she sent the images to Pruin with a single message: "The ridge is breathing." By noon, Pruin had his recalculation. The revised eruptive timeline was 3 to 7 months. The lower bound was now 12 weeks. Zelvara received this information in her office at 1400 hours and sat with it for exactly 90 seconds. Then she walked down the corridor to the administrative center and knocked on Crax's door without waiting for permission to enter. "Administrator," she said, "I am requesting emergency authority to begin voluntary pre-evacuation of non-essential personnel." Crax looked up from his desk. He had circles under his 4 eyes that had not been there a month ago. He was not a stupid man. He had been reading the reports. He was a man who had spent 61 years learning that institutions protected people and that breaking with institutional process was how you caused panic and wasted resources and ended careers. "The Directorate has not yet confirmed the threat classification," he said, but his voice had less conviction than before. "The vents are venting 4 times faster than last month. There is fresh cracking in the Varith Ridge. Pruin's revised timeline gives us 3 to 7 months. If we begin voluntary evacuation now, we move the most vulnerable populations first: children, elderly, non-essential specialists. We reduce the load on emergency transport if full evacuation becomes necessary. And if the threat fails to materialize, we have caused mass disruption, consumed emergency transport resources and undermined colonial confidence in our judgment. If the threat fails to materialize," Zelvara said, "we will have a very comfortable debrief about my overreaction. I will accept any career consequence. But I would like to make that comfortable debrief possible." Crax was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I can authorize voluntary relocation assistance for families with young children and medical dependents. Not a public evacuation. A relocation program." "That is enough to start," Zelvara said. It was not enough, but it was something. And something she had learned was where everything began. Over the next 3 weeks, 847 children and their families, 204 elderly residents, and 91 medical dependents departed Sorvendal on 6 transport runs to the Torellis relay. They left quietly, framed publicly as a capacity management initiative. Most of the remaining 12,858 colonists watched them go and felt something uneasy stir in their chests, but said nothing because the official communication said nothing, and people tend to calibrate their fear to the official register. Pruin Vasile watched the departures from the roof of his laboratory and felt the particular helplessness of a person who knows the scale of the problem and the inadequacy of the response. He ran his models every morning. Every morning they were slightly worse. The plume was accelerating. The pressure chamber was approaching critical threshold. The crack in the ridge was now 900 meters long. He had started sleeping in his laboratory. Not because he needed to. Because the laboratory was in the highest part of the colony, 50 meters above the basin floor, and he had started, in the way that frightened people start doing things they don't fully acknowledge they're doing, seeking high ground. One night, alone with his models, he thought about what the geologists of his home world had found in ancient volcanic zones. Preserved objects, sealed artifacts, sometimes entire structures entombed in hardened lava flows from prehistoric eruptions. The lava had been a destroyer and a preservationist simultaneously. Things buried by lava flows did not decay. They hardened. They endured. In a million years, the stone that would kill you could become your monument. He found this thought simultaneously horrifying and profound. He wrote it in his personal log under the heading Notes on Irony. Outside, the ridge cracked again. Longer this time. The colony's seismometers logged it as a 2.4 magnitude event, the kind that rattled windows and made infants cry. In the morning, Sith Paloran measured the crack at 1,400 meters. The earth was no longer whispering. It was clearing its throat. They called it the breathing night because of what the ground did in the 48 hours before the ridge broke. Sith Paloran documented it in the real-time seismic logs, which he had been monitoring continuously for 11 days by then. Sleeping in 4-hour intervals on a cot she had moved into the monitoring station. The logs showed a pattern she had read about in textbooks but never expected to witness: harmonic tremor. Not the sharp, discrete jolts of normal seismic activity. A continuous hum, low frequency, below the threshold of human or Varenthi hearing, transmitted through the ground as vibration. The colony's sensor arrays picked it up as a sustained signal, oscillating, rhythmic, as if the planet were resonating with its own internal machinery. She called it the breathing night because standing outside at 0200 hours during peak harmonic tremor, she could feel it through her boots. Not hear it. Feel it. A deep, slow pulse like being inside something alive. She called Pruin. She called Zelvara. She sent a Priority 1 alert to the administrative center. Pruin arrived at the monitoring station at 0240 and looked at the seismic readout for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Sith and said, "Get everyone to high ground. Now." "I don't have authority to." "Now," he said, not unkindly, but with a certainty that bypassed the need for authority entirely. He picked up the emergency communication headset and called Commander Zelvara Mox. Zelvara had been awake. She had been awake for most of the last week. When she answered, Pruin said only 4 words: "It is happening tonight." She asked no questions. She pressed the colony-wide emergency alert system, activating the sound that every colonist had been trained to respond to but none had ever heard in a real emergency. The howling klaxon rose through the dark colony at 0248 hours. 3 moons were visible, casting silver light across the basin. The air smelled heavily of sulfur. What followed was not a panic. It was something more complicated, a mass human, or rather Varenthi, attempt to process the collision between understood danger and the instinct to gather belongings, check on neighbors, find children, finish thoughts. People moved, but they did not all move correctly or quickly enough. There were 12,858 colonists remaining in Sorvin Dao. There were 340 emergency vehicles. There were 4 highland routes. Zelvara was everywhere. Or rather, her voice was everywhere, calm and precise through the emergency broadcast network, directing traffic flows, assigning routes, dispatching her already briefed team, Drevos Tan among them, to the critical bottlenecks she had identified weeks ago during her unauthorized planning walks. She had done the preparation that no one asked her to do, and now that preparation was the difference between organized movement and disintegrating chaos. The ridge broke at 0419. Sith Paloran was in an evacuation vehicle heading east on the plateau road when the event horizon crossed. She felt it before she heard it. A deep concussive compression in her chest, the sound of something geologically enormous releasing energy that had been stored for tens of thousands of years. Then the sound reached her. It was not a crack or a boom. It was a roar. Low, sustained, building, the kind of sound that existed below language and above silence, a sound that bypassed consciousness and reached directly into something older than thought. She turned to look back through the vehicle's rear viewport. The Verith Ridge was gone. Not collapsed. Not crumbled. Gone. The entire western face of the ridge, 4.7 kilometers of ancient fractured basalt, had been blown outward by the pressure chamber behind it, and in its place was something that had no equivalent in anything Sith Peloran had ever seen, only in textbooks, only in the ancient geological record. A wall of molten rock, orange-white at its core, dimming to red at its edges, spreading across the basin floor at a speed that her scientist's brain calculated as approximately 45 kilometers per hour in the primary flow channel and still accelerating. The concrete river. It was not, of course, concrete. It was basaltic lava, fluid and ferocious, dense with dissolved gases that gave its surface the visual texture of something half liquid, half solid, a material that could not decide what state it wanted to exist in and so occupied all of them simultaneously. It moved like water in some ways, finding the low points of the terrain, rushing through channels, spreading across flat areas and broad sheets. But it was 100 times heavier than water, and where water would flow around solid objects, the lava simply absorbed them, engulfing them, embedding them, rising over them as if they had never existed. The colony's western district was the first to go. The outlying industrial facilities, the storage complexes, the processing plants, all the large low structures that no one had thought to evacuate because you cannot evacuate a building. They disappeared into the flow in sequences of seconds. The lava did not destroy them in the way fire destroys. It buried them. It filled them. It entered through every opening, and when it had filled all the space inside, it covered the exterior, and within minutes each structure was simply a slight variation in the texture of the lava surface, a bump, a ridge before the flow smoothed even that away. In the central colony zone, where evacuation was still in progress, the lava found the streets. The streets were lower than the adjacent buildings by design, drainage channels, and so the lava entered the streets first and ran along them like burning floodwater. Vehicles that had not yet departed were caught. People who had not yet reached vehicles were caught. Zelvara, monitoring the sensor feeds from a vehicle already on the high plateau, watched the thermal signatures of remaining evacuees with a focus that was beyond emotion, beyond response. It was the focused attention of someone doing everything possible while knowing that some things are not possible. Pruin Vasil was among the last to leave the monitoring station. He had been transmitting data until the feed cut off, collecting every instrument reading available, sending them to the orbital relay that would preserve them long after the colony was gone. He was in a vehicle with 4 others, including Drivos Tan, moving on the northern route at 0441 when the lava reached the colony center. From the northern route he could see the flow clearly. The lava had slowed in the central zone, not stopped, never stopped, but slowed as it spread across the wider basin area, losing energy to surface area. But slow lava was still lava. At 5 kilometers per hour, it still flowed continuously, filling every depression, surrounding every structure, rising with the terrible patience of something that had nothing but time. He watched it cover the colony center. He watched it cover the administrative complex. He watched it cover his laboratory, the building where he had slept on a cot and run his models and written about irony in his personal log. He thought about what he had written. About things buried by lava. About preservation. About monuments built by catastrophe. The colony was being buried alive but not destroyed. It was being sealed. In 66 million years, when creatures with different names and different eyes walked this land, they would find beneath their feet a stratum of ancient basalt containing, perfectly preserved in stone, the outline of a colony. They would find alloy walls and polymer floors. They would find the shapes of machines and the shapes of lives. And they would wonder, with the limitless curiosity of beings who had not yet learned to fear the ground they walked on, what had lived here. Pruin Vasil, riding north through the pre-dawn darkness, thought that was almost enough. Almost. The Highland staging area at Kethova had been designed for 800 people. It now held 11,247. The tents, erected in the 4 hours between Zelvara's preparation and the ridge break, were not large enough. The food stocks were not sufficient for more than 3 days. The medical facility was a prefabricated unit built for routine care, not mass trauma. The communication arrays were working, but the orbital relay was overwhelmed with simultaneous transmissions from every person trying to contact family off-world. None of this was a crisis. It was a logistics problem, and Zelvara Mox was, among other things, an excellent logistician. She stood at the center of the staging area at 0900 hours, 6 hours after the ridge break, and directed operations with the focused efficiency of someone who has moved past grief by entering action. The grief would come later. She knew that. For now there was water distribution, medical triage, shelter expansion, and the passenger manifest. The manifest was the hardest thing. Of the 12,858 people who had been in the colony when the alert sounded, 11,247 had reached Kethova or one of the secondary highland sites. That was 88.2%. In an unannounced volcanic emergency with less than 90 minutes between the first alert and lava reaching the colony center, 88.2% survival was a number that her emergency response textbooks had classified as extraordinary. It did not feel extraordinary. It felt like 1,611 people. Drivos Tan brought her the preliminary breakdown at 1100. Of the 1,611 unaccounted for, approximately 400 were confirmed to have reached secondary sites not yet in communication. The orbital sensors, still operational, were searching the plateau roads for stranded vehicles. 41 people had been extracted by air from elevated positions after the flow cut off road routes. That left, by the most conservative estimate, approximately 1,170 people unaccounted for. Zelvara looked at that number for a long time. Then she looked up and said, "Continue extraction operations. Full asset deployment. No withdrawal until orbital sensors confirm there are no more heat signatures in accessible zones." "Commander," said the Air Operations Chief, a compact female named Vranatala, "the lava field is still active. Air assets are at the edge of their thermal tolerance." "I know." "Continue." The extraction operations ran for 11 more hours. They brought out 63 additional survivors from isolated positions, from rooftops, from a thermal-rated emergency shelter that had been triggered automatically when its occupants could not reach vehicles. A team of 4 colonists had sheltered in a polymer storage tank on elevated ground and survived the flow passing beneath them. They were found at dusk, shaken but alive, and when they emerged from the tank and saw the vast gray-black plain that had been their city, they were silent for a long time. Final accounting. Of the original 14,000 colonists of Sorvin-Dal, 11,429 survived. 2,571 did not. Among the dead were people who had not heard the alarm in time, people who had gone back for belongings, people who had been trapped in sections of the colony where the lava moved faster than any model had predicted, and a small number of people who had, for reasons never fully understood, simply not moved. Among the survivors were 847 children whose pre-evacuation the week before had been framed as a routine relocation program. Every single one of them was alive. Pruin Vasil sat outside his tent that evening and watched the horizon to the south glow orange and red. The eruption was not over. The Deccan traps would erupt, in total, for approximately 30,000 years, in geological terms barely an eye blink, in biological terms a slow planetary catastrophe. The sky above the highland staging area was already noticeably hazy with volcanic aerosols that would, over the coming decades, affect temperature, precipitation, and growing conditions across much of the continent. They could not stay here. They could not return to the basin. They could not stay on this planet much longer. He was composing, in his head, the report he would write when he had the energy to write it. It would be a scientific document about volcanic event prediction and colonial emergency response. It would be submitted to the Planetary Science Directorate. It would eventually be cited in geological studies of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary event, the same volcanic episode that would, in another 66 million years, be investigated by creatures with 2 eyes and 10 fingers who would have no idea that the basalt layers they were drilling through contained, beneath their instruments, the preserved ghost of an alien city. He thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. About what was left behind. The colony was not destroyed. It was entombed. The lava had been an indiscriminate archivist, preserving everything it covered with perfect geological fidelity. Every wall, every floor, every instrument panel, every personal item not taken in the evacuation, sealed in basalt that would cool and harden and compress over millions of years into something as permanent as stone could be. The Varenthi civilization would move on. They always moved on. They were survivors by nature, by culture, by the hard-won experience of a species that had faced extinction twice before and survived both times by the combination of intelligence and stubbornness and the occasional willingness to listen to the scientist in the room. But Sorvin-Dal would remain. It would remain as something no Varenthi hand would ever touch again, a time capsule buried by catastrophe, preserved by the same forces that had destroyed it, waiting in geological silence for discoverers who did not yet exist. Drivos Tan sat down beside Pruin as the stars came out above the ash-filtered sky. They were dimmer than usual, the aerosols already beginning their long work of atmospheric alteration. "Do you think anyone will find it?" Drivos asked. He had read Pruin's personal log without asking. Pruin had noticed and had not minded. Yes, Pruin said. In time. Everything buried gets found eventually if you have enough time. And this planet has more time than anything deserves. Will they know what we were? Pruin considered that. They will know we built things. They will know we were here. Whether they will know what we were is a different question. He paused. What are we? Drevos thought about it. We left, he finally said. When the ground told us to leave, enough of us left. That's something. That is something, Pruin agreed. Above them, the hazy stars of a wounded world shone on, ancient and patient, recording nothing, forgetting nothing. The Tyrellus relay station was not built for grief. It was built for logistics. It was a refueling and resupply hub for 14 colonial routes, staffed by 300 technicians and administrators who dealt in cargo manifests and fuel calculations and transit schedules. It was not a place where people came to recover from the loss of a world. But 11,429 people had nowhere else to go, and so they came here. The station's nominal population capacity was 2,000. In the weeks following the Sorvin-Dal evacuation, it held 6 times that number, colonists sleeping in cargo bays and maintenance corridors, in the station's 3 recreation modules that had been converted to dormitories by the simple removal of everything not a sleeping surface. The station's commander, a pragmatic logistics specialist named Orith Val, spent 14 consecutive days in a state of controlled improvisation, solving, in sequence, food supply, water recycling, medical capacity, psychological support, communication backlog, and the purely organizational problem of tracking 11,429 individuals across a structure not designed for them. She found in this process that the people from Sorvin-Dal were, as a population, unusually organized. They had come through an event that should, by statistical expectation, have produced high levels of trauma-driven dysfunction. Instead, they had, by the time they arrived at Tyrellus, already begun self-organizing. Neighborhood groups had reconstituted on the evacuation transports. Work teams had formed spontaneously to assist station operations. People had, without being asked, begun cataloging what they had brought out, what skills they possessed, what was needed. Orith Val, watching this from her command center, found herself thinking that these were people who had been told the truth in time. Not early enough to prevent all loss, but early enough to act. And the act of acting, even under catastrophic conditions, had done something to them. It had maintained, against significant pressure, their capacity for collective agency. She mentioned this to Zelvara Mox, who had arrived on the same transport as the last evacuation group and had been awake for 31 hours by the time she reached the station. Zelvara listened without expression, the expression of someone too tired to show what she was feeling, and then said, Pruin Vasil told us the truth. The rest of us either believed him or managed to do the right things before we finished believing. That is the whole story. The formal inquiry began 6 weeks after evacuation. It was conducted by a 3-member board from the Varenthi Colonial Authority, a body with broad investigative powers and the specific mandate to determine whether the Sorvin-Dal evacuation had been properly managed. The inquiry's existence was not punitive in intent, it was procedural. After every major colonial event, the authority reviewed decisions, identified systemic failures, and issued recommendations. It was how a civilization that made mistakes avoided making the same ones twice. Krax testified for 4 days. He was honest, a quality that surprised the inquiry board and increased their respect for him, about the decisions he had made and the reasoning behind them. He had followed institutional process. He had sought confirmation before acting. He had managed, within his constraints, to authorize the early voluntary evacuation that had saved 847 children before the main event. He had not moved fast enough, but he had moved in the right direction. The board's ultimate finding was neither exoneration nor condemnation. It was a careful, detailed document that traced the specific points at which institutional process had created delay, identified the confirmation requirements that had slowed response by an estimated 3 weeks, and recommended specific protocol changes for future colonial geological threat management. The document was called the Sorvin Report. It would be referenced in colonial authority policy for the next 2 centuries. Among its specific recommendations, geological survey teams at all colonial sites should be empowered to issue mandatory preliminary evacuation orders without waiting for directorate confirmation when Category Omega indicators were present. Commander-level authority for emergency preparation activities should be clarified and expanded. The standard timeline for emergency transport requisition should be compressed from 14 months to 6. These were not dramatic recommendations. They were administrative changes. But administrative changes, applied consistently across 14 colonial routes, were how civilizations learned from the people they had lost. Pruin Vasile gave his scientific testimony on the 5th day of the inquiry. He brought his original models, his revised models, all 200 simulation runs, the complete instrument record from the monitoring station up to the moment the feed cut out. He walked the board through the geological event with the precision of someone who had been preparing this explanation for weeks, not to justify himself, but because he believed the science deserved to be understood. At the end of his testimony, one of the inquiry board members, an older female named Seth Morin who had been reviewing colonial crises for 30 years, asked him a question that was not in the official inquiry protocol. "You wrote in your personal log," she said, "about what the concrete river preserved. You used the word monument. Do you still believe that?" Pruin thought about it for a longer moment than he usually allowed himself in formal testimony. "I believe," he said carefully, "that the colony is preserved with a completeness and permanence that nothing else would have provided. The Varenthi settle worlds and leave them. We rarely stay long enough to become part of the geology. Sorvendal is part of the geology now. In 100 million years, if anything intelligent walks that ground, they will find us there, intact, exact, answering questions no one has thought to ask yet." He paused. "Whether that is a monument or a tragedy depends on where you are standing when you ask the question. From here it feels like both." The board member nodded slowly. She did not write anything in the inquiry record. Some things are not for records. Outside the station's viewports, the stars moved in their ancient courses, indifferent as always to the creatures navigating between them. But those creatures navigated anyway, carrying what they had learned, carrying the names of those they had lost, carrying the particular gravity of a people who had looked into the face of a dying world and brought out, against the odds, more than they had thought possible. It was not enough. It was never enough. It was also always more than nothing. The Torellis relay station was not built for grief. It was built for logistics. It was a refueling and resupply hub for 14 colonial routes, staffed by 300 technicians and administrators who dealt in cargo manifests and fuel calculations and transit schedules. It was not a place where people came to recover from the loss of a world. But 11,429 people had nowhere else to go, and so they came here. The station's nominal population capacity was 2,000. In the weeks following the Sorvendal evacuation, it held 6 times that number, colonists sleeping in cargo bays and maintenance corridors, in the station's 3 recreation modules that had been converted to dormitories by the simple removal of everything not a sleeping surface. The station's commander, a pragmatic logistics specialist named Orith Val, spent 14 consecutive days in a state of controlled improvisation, solving, in sequence, food supply, water recycling, medical capacity, psychological support, communication backlog, and the purely organizational problem of tracking 11,429 individuals across a structure not designed for them. She found in this process that the people from Sorvendal were, as a population, unusually organized. They had come through an event that should, by statistical expectation, have produced high levels of trauma-driven dysfunction. Instead, they had, by the time they arrived at Torellis, already begun self-organizing. Neighborhood groups had reconstituted on the evacuation transports. Work teams had formed spontaneously to assist station operations. People had, without being asked, begun cataloging what they had brought out, what skills they possessed, what was needed. Orith Val, watching this from her command center, found herself thinking that these were people who had been told the truth in time. Not early enough to prevent all loss but early enough to act. And the act of acting, even under catastrophic conditions, had done something to them. It had maintained, against significant pressure, their capacity for collective agency. She mentioned this to Zelvara Mox, who had arrived on the same transport as the last evacuation group and had been awake for 31 hours by the time she reached the station. Zelvara listened without expression, the expression of someone too tired to show what she was feeling, and then said, "Pruin Vasile told us the truth. The rest of us either believed him or managed to do the right things before we finished believing. That is the whole story." The formal inquiry began 6 weeks after evacuation. It was conducted by a 3-member board from the Varenthi Colonial Authority, a body with broad investigative powers and the specific mandate to determine whether the Sorvendal evacuation had been properly managed. The inquiry's existence was not punitive in intent, it was procedural. After every major colonial event, the authority reviewed decisions, identified systemic failures, and issued recommendations. It was how a civilization that made mistakes avoided making the same ones twice. Krax testified for 4 days. He was honest, a quality that surprised the inquiry board and increased their respect for him, about the decisions he had made and the reasoning behind them. He had followed institutional process. He had sought confirmation before acting. He had managed, within his constraints, to authorize the early voluntary evacuation that had saved 847 children before the main event. He had not moved fast enough, but he had moved in the right direction. The board's ultimate finding was neither exoneration nor condemnation. It was a careful, detailed document that traced the specific points at which institutional process had created delay, identified the confirmation requirements that had slowed response by an estimated 3 weeks, and recommended specific protocol changes for future colonial geological threat management. The document was called the Sorvin Report. It would be referenced in colonial authority policy for the next 2 centuries. Among its specific recommendations, geological survey teams at all colonial sites should be empowered to issue mandatory preliminary evacuation orders without waiting for directorate confirmation when Category Omega indicators were present. Commander-level authority for emergency preparation activities should be clarified and expanded. The standard timeline for emergency transport requisition should be compressed from 14 months to 6. These were not dramatic recommendations. They were administrative changes. But administrative changes, applied consistently across 14 colonial routes, were how civilizations learned from the people they had lost. Pruin Vasile gave his scientific testimony on the 5th day of the inquiry. He brought his original models, his revised models, all 200 simulation runs, the complete instrument record from the monitoring station up to the moment the feed cut out. He walked the board through the geological event with the precision of someone who had been preparing this explanation for weeks, not to justify himself, but because he believed the science deserved to be understood. At the end of his testimony, one of the inquiry board members, an older female named Seth Morin who had been reviewing colonial crises for 30 years, asked him a question that was not in the official inquiry protocol. "You wrote in your personal log," she said, "about what the concrete river preserved. You used the word monument. Do you still believe that?" Pruin thought about it for a longer moment than he usually allowed himself in formal testimony. "I believe," he said carefully, "that the colony is preserved with a completeness and permanence that nothing else would have provided. The Varenthi settle worlds and leave them. We rarely stay long enough to become part of the geology. Sorvindal is part of the geology now. In 100 million years, if anything intelligent walks that ground, they will find us there, intact, exact, answering questions no one has thought to ask yet." He paused. "Whether that is a monument or a tragedy depends on where you are standing when you ask the question. From here it feels like both." The board member nodded slowly. She did not write anything in the inquiry record. Some things are not for records. Outside the station's viewports, the stars moved in their ancient courses, indifferent as always to the creatures navigating between them. But those creatures navigated anyway, carrying what they had learned, carrying the names of those they had lost, carrying the particular gravity of a people who had looked into the face of a dying world and brought out, against the odds, more than they had thought possible. It was not enough. It was never enough. It was also always more than nothing.